shocking will leaves a vast fortune to a penniless actress, making everyone a suspect. But when she's found dead, the doctor blames a heart attack. Only Miss Marple notices the bitter almond scent and a strange, empty locket. Was it a tragic accident or a cunning murder? A confession points to one man, but Miss Marple suspects the true killer is hiding in plain sight, using a centuries-old secret to cover their crime. Chapter 1. The Gathering at Chimneys. The afternoon air at Chimneys hung heavy and damp, smelling of old leather, faded tapestries, and the faint, persistent ghost of wood smoke. Miss Jane Marple, a figure of serene calm in her tweed suit and sensible hat, stepped out of the hired motor car and onto the gravelled drive. Chimneys, a name that conjured images of grand Victorian comfort, was, in reality, a sprawling Georgian manor in a state of genteel disrepair. Its once pristine white facade was now streaked with grey, and a vine of stubborn ivy had begun to claw its way toward the upstairs windows like a green hand. Her hostess, Lady Agnes, appeared in the doorway, a shock of electric blue silk against the muted gloom of the interior. Lady Agnes was a woman who believed in making a statement, even if that statement was "I have forgotten what year it is." Her silver hair was piled in an architectural confection that defied gravity, and she greeted Miss Marple not with a handshake, but with a dramatic sweep of her hand. "Jane. My dear, darling Jane. I'm so glad you could brave the elements. It's a miserable day, isn't it? The sort of day when the ghosts feel particularly lively." She said this with a conspiratorial wink, as if the notion of a spectral house party was the most delightful thing in the world. Miss Marple smiled gently. "It's a lovely day for a pot of tea, Agnes. I must say, the house is just as I remember it." Lady Agnes's laugh was a dry, rustling sound. "Ah, yes, stagnating gracefully, just like me. Come in, come in. You're the first to arrive. We have a rather marvellous little collection of misfits descending upon us this weekend. You'll find it all terribly diverting, I'm sure." As Miss Marple was shown to her roomer quaint chamber with a view of the neglected rose garden, she noticed the subtle signs of decay that spoke volumes. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, the carpet was threadbare, and a large crack spiderwebbed across the ceiling. This was not a house in decline. It was a house holding its breath. By tea time, the other guests had begun to trickle in. The first was Sir Humphrey Gower, a pompous politician whose booming voice preceded him down the corridor. He was a man of inflated self-importance, a great, florid bull in a china shop of delicate antiques. He spoke exclusively in political soundbites, each sentence a thinly veiled attempt to assert his own grandeur. "Agnes, my dear," he announced, puffing out his chest, "one can't help but feel that Chimneys has seen better days. It's a disgrace, a national disgrace, that such a fine estate is allowed to fall into such a state of disrepair." Lady Agnes merely raised a sculpted eyebrow. "The house and I are quite in agreement, Humphrey. We are both rather fond of our own little eccentricities. Now, do have a scone." Following Sir Humphrey was Mr. Alistair Finch, a man so nondescript he almost seemed to fade into the woodwork. He was a financier, a quiet individual with watchful, calculating eyes that missed nothing. He greeted Miss Marple with a polite, almost practiced nod, and then settled into an armchair, his gaze sweeping over the room, assessing its value. Miss Marple, with her keen eye for human nature, sensed in him a man who dealt in secrets, a man for whom everyone had a price. The final two guests arrived together in a flurry of creative energy and youthful beauty. Julian Devereux, a flamboyant artist with a cascade of dark hair and an expressive scarf, entered first, his hands gesturing wildly as he spoke. "Darling Agnes." The traffic was utterly barbaric. It was as though all of London had decided to take a pilgrimage to the middle of nowhere. "But it's all worth it, of course, to see you and your glorious, magnificent ruin of a house." He was followed by the young actress Ilara Vance. Her beauty was not the sort that demanded attention, but a more subtle, delicate kind. She was quiet, almost shy, her gaze downcast, and her hands were clasped tightly together. Miss Marple noticed her more by her stillness than by her movement. She was a single, silent note in a cacophony of egos. Ilara wore a simple black dress, but around her neck was a piece of jewelry that caught Miss Marple's eye, a small, antique silver locket, intricate and tarnished with age. As the guests settled, an unspoken tension began to simmer just beneath the surface of polite conversation. Sir Humphrey held court, pontificating on the failings of the current government, while Alistair Finch watched him with a thin, knowing smile. Julian Devereux, with a mischievous glint in his eye, would occasionally interject with a biting artistic observation that seemed to disarm everyone. "My dear Sir Humphrey," Julian said, gesturing to the politician's expansive waistcoat, "you are the living embodiment of a Gainsborough portrait, if Gainsborough had been a particularly hungry man and had been painting with a palette of pure bombast." Sir Humphrey's face turned a darker shade of crimson, but before he could respond, Lady Agnes clapped her hands together, a sound that seemed to echo in the cavernous drawing-room. "Dinner, everyone, and none of that dreary talk of politics or art. Tonight we shall speak of happier things, like the dead." This last sentence, delivered with a theatrical flourish, brought a sudden, unsettling silence to the room. Miss Marple, who had been quietly knitting, simply paused, her needles clicking to a stop. Dinner was a peculiar affair. The food, though simple, was delicious, but the conversation was stilted and unnatural. Miss Marple noted how each guest, in their own way, seemed to be holding back a secret. Sir Humphrey's blustering seemed designed to mask a deep anxiety. Alistair Finch's silence was a wall built of unspoken facts. Julian Devereux's wit felt like a desperate attempt to distract from something, and Ilara Vance, the young actress, was a mystery. She barely spoke, and when she did, it was in a soft, musical voice that was almost lost in the grand dining hall. As the main course was cleared, Lady Agnes raised her wineglass. "To my late husband, dear old Lord Chimneys. He was a marvellous man, if a bit of a scoundrel. He always did love a good mystery, and I have a feeling we shall all be privy to one in the morning." The comment was met with a chorus of uncomfortable coughs and shuffling. Miss Marple, however, simply watched. She saw the way Sir Humphrey's hand, holding his wineglass, trembled ever so slightly. She saw Alistair Finch's eyes flick to Ilara Vance, a flicker of something dark and possessive in his gaze. She saw Julian Devereux's face lose its theatrical mask for a moment, revealing a flash of genuine fear. The silence that followed Lady Agnes's toast was profound. It wasn't a peaceful silence, but a living, breathing thing, full of unspoken words and unconfessed sins. It was the silence of a house about to tell a secret, and of a group of people who would soon wish they had never been invited to hear it. The air grew colder, and Miss Marple felt a shiver run up her spine. It was a premonition, a quiet, certain knowledge that the unravelling of a dark tale was about to begin. Chapter 2. The Unwelcome Inheritance. The morning arrived with a thin, watery sunlight that did little to dispel the gloom that had settled over Chimneys. The previous night's silence had been a foreboding, a quiet anticipation of something to come. This morning, however, the air was thick with a new, more potent kind of tension. It was the palpable strain of unspoken resentments and frustrated ambition. Miss Marple was the first to descend to the breakfast room. She found it empty, save for Lady Agnes, who was already sipping her tea, her eccentric attire a splash of colour against the room's faded wallpaper. A small, black-clad figure stood by the fireplace, a man whose dour expression and formal suit seemed a startling intrusion on the casual atmosphere of a weekend house party. "Jane, my dear, do come in," Lady Agnes said, her voice unusually subdued. "This is Mr. Pennington, Lord Chimney's solicitor. He's here to read the will." Miss Marple nodded politely to the solicitor, who simply inclined his head, his face a mask of professional neutrality. This was a most unexpected turn of events. A will reading was not a typical weekend diversion, and its suddenness suggested that Lord Chimney's final wishes were not a matter for private reflection, but for immediate public disclosure. Slowly, the other guests began to trickle in. Sir Humphrey Gower entered with a confident air, a man who believed in his own entitlement. Mr. Alistair Finch followed, his eyes darting between Lady Agnes and the solicitor, his calculating mind clearly working overtime. Julian Devereux, looking pale and nervous for all his usual bravado, was the last to arrive, his colourful scarf a startling contrast to his grey mood. The most conspicuous absence was Alara Vance. "Alara is feeling a touch faint this morning," Lady Agnes explained with a wave of her hand. "Poor girl. It's all been rather overwhelming, I'm afraid. But she will be down shortly." Once all were assembled, Mr. Pennington cleared his throat. "If you would all please take a seat. I have been instructed by the late Lord Chimneys to read his final will and testament to those gathered here this morning." A hush fell over the room. Sir Humphrey sat forward in his chair, a smug look on his face, as though he were preparing to accept a prize. Alistair Finch's eyes narrowed, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles turned white. Julian Devereux fidgeted with his scarf, a nervous energy radiating from him. Miss Marple, quietly observing from a corner, simply waited. She had seen this kind of tension before, the avarice and expectation coiled in a room like a venomous snake. Mr. Pennington began in a dry, monotonous voice, detailing the various bequests. There were small legacies to staff, a collection of books to a distant relative, a few minor trusts. The amounts mentioned were surprisingly small, which drew a collective frown from the guests. The grand estate of Chimneys and the bulk of the Lord's considerable fortune, however, were conspicuously absent from this list. Then Mr. Pennington's voice changed, becoming slightly more pronounced as he read the final, most crucial clause: "To my beloved friend and companion, Miss Vance, in recognition of her unwavering kindness and the pure joy she brought to my final years, I bequeath the entirety of my estate, including the house and grounds known as Chimneys, and the remainder of my fortune to be held in her name in perpetuity." A pin drop would have sounded like a cannonball. For a long, dreadful moment, no one spoke. The shock was so profound it was almost a physical presence in the room. Then the silence shattered. "Preposterous!" boomed Sir Humphrey, leaping to his feet, his face a mottled purple with rage. "This is an outrage. I was promised a significant investment in my campaign, Lord Chimneys assured me. This is the work of a scheming, manipulative little actress." Alistair Finch, in contrast, did not speak. He simply stood up, his face a mask of cold fury, and walked to the window. He stared out at the neglected garden, his hands balled into tight fists, his body radiating a silent, simmering violence. His was not the bluster of a cheated politician, but the quiet, deadly anger of a financier who had been outmaneuvered. Julian. Devereux threw his hands up in a theatrical gesture of disgust. Good heavens, the man had no taste, not a shred of it. To leave such a magnificent piece of architecture to a girl who probably couldn't tell a Rembrandt from a road sign. It is an artistic crime of the highest order. Even Lady Agnes, for all her composure, seemed stunned. She put a hand to her chest, her gaze fixed on the solicitor. He never told me. The old fox. He never said a word. There was a flicker of something raw in her deep-seated bitterness. It was at that moment that Alara Vance entered the room, looking pale and fragile, her eyes wide with bewilderment. She carried with her a single piece of paper, the official copy of the will. The locket that Miss Marple had noticed the night before was clutched in her other hand. There she is. Sir Humphrey thundered, pointing an accusing finger. The little gold-digger. Did you blackmail him? Did you poison his mind against his family and his friends? I demand an explanation. Alara shrank back, a look of genuine terror on her face. I don't understand. This is a mistake. He couldn't have. Miss Marple, her quiet presence a calming force, intervened. Sir Humphrey, there is no need for such an outburst. The will has been read, and the matter is settled. Her voice trembling, turned to Lady Agnes. I don't want it. I can't take it. I had no idea. He just talked to me sometimes. He said I was a good listener. Alistair Finch turned from the window, his voice low and dangerous. A good listener or a good actress. A performance, perhaps, that netted you a fortune. Overwhelmed. Alara backed away from the group, her eyes welling with tears. Miss Marple, seeing her distress, followed her out of the room. She found the young woman leaning against a wall in the hallway, her head in her hands, the will and the locket still clutched tightly. Miss Vance, Miss Marple said softly, you appear quite distressed. This is a rather large inheritance. To feel so unhappy about. Alara looked up, her face streaked with tears. It's not right. He was so kind to me, but I never asked for anything. He found me crying one day in a park after a terrible play I was in. He said I had a gentle soul. He said I reminded him of a flower that had been trampled on but was still trying to grow. He gave me this. She held out the silver locket. He said it was a family piece, a little token of a secret promise. He said he would always look out for me. Miss Marple's gaze softened. And the promise? He just said he would ensure I was taken care of. He said it was a very old locket, a family heirloom from a different time. Her fingers traced its intricate pattern, a fragile gesture of comfort. I just want to go to my room. I can't. Face them. Miss Marple watched as Alara, the sudden and unwilling heiress, ascended the grand staircase. She was a solitary, vulnerable figure, clutching the twin symbols of her newfound wealth and its accompanying danger. The rustling of the will in her hand and the slight jingle of the locket were the last sounds Miss Marple heard before the house fell into a deeper, more malevolent silence. It was the silence of a house where a will had just been read, and a poison of a far deadlier sort had been unleashed. The game, Miss Marple knew, had just begun. Chapter 3. The Doctor's Diagnosis. The dawn that followed the reading. of the will was not greeted by the usual clatter of teacups and polite conversation. Instead, the morning air was split by a piercing scream that seemed to echo through every corridor and up every staircase of chimneys. It was a sound born of pure terror, and it brought every guest out of their slumber with a jolt. Miss Marple was already dressed, her quiet routine a bomb against the house's rising tension. She opened her door to find a young chambermaid, her face ashen, standing in the hallway, pointing a trembling finger toward the end of the corridor. "The actress, ma'am," the maid stammered, her voice thick with horror. She's not breathing." Within minutes, the small upstairs landing was a tableau of shock and confusion. Sir Humphrey Gower, his silk dressing gown hastily thrown on, was blustering, his voice a panicked roar that he tried to frame as authority. A simple fright, no doubt. A vapid young woman prone to dramatics. "Don't just stand there. Someone summon the doctor." Alistair Finch stood apart from the group, his face a cold, impenetrable mask. His eyes, however, moved with a feverish intensity, calculating the new variables this unexpected death introduced. Julian Devereux, for all his theatricality, seemed genuinely shaken, his hands clasped over his mouth, his face a picture of horror. Lady Agnes, her eccentric mask having finally shattered, looked utterly bereft, clutching the banister for support, her earlier pronouncements of mysteries and secrets now tasting of ashes. When Dr. Ainsworth, the local country practitioner, arrived, he moved with the weary efficiency of a man who had seen too much. He was a sturdy man, with kind eyes, but a certain brusqueness that came from years of dealing with country ailments and the occasional unexpected tragedy. He went into Alara Vance's room alone, the door closing behind him with a quiet click. That seemed to punctuate the silence on the landing. The wait was unbearable. Miss Marple, however, used the time to observe. She noted the way Sir Humphrey kept glancing at his watch, a man already thinking of the next stage of his life, now that his financial promises had vanished. She saw the calculating intensity in Alistair Finch's stare, a man whose mind was already working on a new investment strategy. Julian Devereux had retreated to a corner, his face buried in his hands, his flamboyant persona replaced by a fragile humanity. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor emerged. He pulled the door shut behind him, his face grave but not overly concerned. "I am afraid it's a severe heart attack," he announced, his voice low but authoritative. "A congenital weakness, perhaps. The poor girl must have had a terribly weak heart. A shock like that, the news of the inheritance. It was likely too much for her delicate constitution." A collective sigh of relief, subtle but undeniable, swept through the group. A heart attack, a natural death. It was a tidy, convenient conclusion that allowed everyone to breathe again, to distance themselves from the poisoned atmosphere of the previous day. "Tragic, but understandable," Sir Humphrey muttered, already regaining some of his composure. "A great deal of stress for a young woman of her station." "A beautiful tragedy, really," Julian Devereux said with a shake of his head, beginning to find his artistic bearings once more. Miss Marple, however, did not move. She felt a quiet, persistent unease. The doctor's pronouncement, while plausible, felt incomplete. She had to see for herself. With a quiet grace, she approached the doctor. "Dr. Ainsworth," she said in her soft, unassuming voice, "might I have a moment to collect my thoughts? I believe I left my knitting needles in the sitting room, but I would like to see if I am mistaken." It was a perfect, innocuous excuse. The doctor, slightly bewildered but polite, agreed. Miss Marple slipped past him and into the room. The sight was as tragic as the maid had described. Alara lay still in her bed, her hands folded over her chest. The room was neat, the curtains drawn against the harsh sunlight. But as Miss Marple stepped closer, her keen senses, so often dismissed as an old woman's fussiness, began to register a series of details that the doctor had clearly missed. First there was the smell, faint, almost imperceptible to an untrained nose. It was a bitter, metallic scent that lingered in the air like a phantom. It was the smell of bitter almonds, a smell that Miss Marple, from her deep well of rural knowledge, knew could only come from one source. Then her eyes fell upon Elara's hands. They were still clasped, but what they held was not a simple, peaceful gesture. Clutched in her right hand was the locket, the same intricate silver locket that she had worn with such pride the day before. But now it was open, and it was empty. Miss Marple's eyes, as sharp as a robin's, noted a strange purplish stain on the inside of the locket's hollow. It was a residue, a trace of some substance that had been held within its tiny confines. There was also a subtle, almost invisible, bluish tinge to Alara's lips, a detail that the doctor, in his haste, had failed to notice, or perhaps had simply dismissed as a lack of proper circulation. She carefully, gently, closed the door behind her, her mind racing. The diagnosis of a heart attack, the convenient, non-criminal explanation, was a lie. The bitter almond smell, the empty locket, the strange stain, they all pointed to one thing. Alara Vance had not died of natural causes. She had been poisoned. Miss Marple's gentle demeanour hardened into a quiet resolve. She knew the truth, and she knew she was the only one who did. The locket, once a symbol of a secret promise, was now the key to a far more sinister secret. The doctor's convenient conclusion had simply provided the murderer with the perfect cover. The game, Miss Marple knew with a chilling certainty, had not just begun, it had already claimed its first victim, and now she was the only one left to hunt for the killer. Chapter 4. A Poison in the Past. The days at Chimneys, once filled with the mundane tensions of a house party, had now taken on a funereal hush. The guests, under the shadow of Alara Vance's sudden death, moved like ghosts through the grand, decaying rooms. But while they accepted the convenient fiction of a heart attack, Miss Marple knew better. She moved through the house with a quiet purpose, a small, unassuming spider in a web of deceit. Her investigation was not one of forced interrogations or dramatic accusations. Instead, it was a subtle art of listening, of stitching together the stray threads of conversation that others carelessly left behind. She would knit by the fire while listening to Sir Humphrey Gower's blustering, or prune a dead rose in the garden while listening to Lady Agnes' grief-stricken ramblings. She was a confidant without being a threat, and secrets began to fall into her lap like ripe plums. She found her first thread with Sir Humphrey. He had been drowning his sorrows in brandy, his political ambitions now a smouldering ruin. Agnes, he grumbled one afternoon, his voice thick with both grief and resentment. That blasted old fool Lord Chimneys promised me everything. He swore he would fund my campaign, promised a glorious future for this country, and then he just took it away, said he had a better investment in mind. He ruined me, Agnes, ruined me completely. Miss Marple, hearing this from a quiet corner of the library, understood immediately. Sir Humphrey's fury was not simply the rage of a greedy man, but the desperate anger of a man whose entire life's work had been maliciously destroyed. Lord Chimneys had not just disappointed him, he had deliberately set a trap and watched him fall into it. Sir Humphrey had a motive, one born of bitter, humiliating betrayal. Next, Miss Marple turned her attention to Mr. Alistair Finch. He was a man of quiet habits, and she found him in the billiard room, idly rolling a ball across the green felt. He barely acknowledged her, his mind clearly a million miles away. With a gentle sigh, she began to talk about the weather, about the changing seasons. She saw his eyes flicker. Lord Chimneys, she said, as if it were a simple observation, was a man who knew a great deal about people's pasts, I imagine. A man with a very long memory, perhaps. Finch's hand froze on the billiard cue. He turned to her, his composure finally cracking. He was a man who loved to hold secrets, he hissed, his voice barely a whisper. He knew about a small indiscretion, a financial maneuver I made years ago. It was a foolish thing, but it would have ruined me. He had me under his thumb. He would call me, threaten to expose me, just for sport. I was his puppet, and he enjoyed the show. Miss Marple simply nodded, her needles clicking again. The financier, a man who built his empire on a foundation of control, had been completely controlled by Lord Chimneys. His motive was not just financial, but a deep, seething hatred born of years of quiet blackmail. The final piece of the motive puzzle came from Julian Devereux. He had been sketching Elara Vance's portrait, his hands trembling as he drew. Miss Marple, seeing the genuine grief in his eyes, sat down beside him. She was a lovely young woman, Miss Marple said softly. Julian let out a heavy sigh. She was. And Lord Chimneys took a beautiful thing and twisted it into something ugly. He had promised to sponsor my greatest work, a series of frescoes, for a new gallery. He gave me an advance, let me build my hopes. Then he simply cancelled the commission, and, to make it worse, he published a scathing article in a national paper saying I was a hack, an amateur. The gallery director believed him. I lost everything. My reputation, my money, my chance to create something truly great. He enjoyed seeing me suffer. Julian threw his pencil down in a burst of frustration. He was a monster, Jane, a complete, an utter monster. As the motives became clear, a complex picture began to emerge. Each of the guests, save for Miss Marple and the tragic Elara, had a profound and personal reason to want Lord Chimneys dead. But the question remained, who had done it, and how? The answer came not from the guests, but from the house itself, from the very core of Chimneys's history. Miss Marple, while wandering through the great hall, came across Lady Agnes, who was dusting a portrait of a stern-looking man in a ruff. My ancestor, Lord Alistair Chimneys, Lady Agnes said, her voice distant. A rather nasty man, I'm told, but an interesting history. You know, he had that locket made, the one Elara was wearing. Miss Marple's heart gave a little lurch. Did he now? For a lover, I presume. Oh heavens, no. Lady Agnes laughed, a hollow sound. For a rival. There was a famous scandal, you see. He hated his rival, another lord, and he had that locket fashioned with a tiny compartment inside. He was a collector of ancient poisons. He used it to put a few drops of a rare, forgotten poison into his rival's wine. It was a dreadful secret, a dark legend that has been passed down. It worked beautifully, they said. It looked like a heart attack. Miss Marple's mind, like a finely tuned machine, clicked into place. The locket, a family heirloom, was not a symbol of affection but a vessel of death. And the poison it had contained was not a modern concoction but a rare, almost forgotten compound, a poison whose symptoms would be easily mistaken for a heart attack. She felt a cold dread wash over her. The murder of Alara Vance was not a crime of opportunity. It was a cold, calculated act, an echo of a century-old atrocity. The killer had not simply found a weapon. They had found a secret, a dark family recipe for murder. The knowledge of that poison and its method of delivery pointed to a killer who was not just present at Chimneys, but intimately connected to its sinister past. The game had just changed. The murder was not just a crime of passion, but a crime of deep historical knowledge, and Miss Marple knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the killer was standing right beside her, hidden in plain sight. Chapter 5. The Unspoken Confession. The gloom of Chimneys felt heavier than ever, a tangible blanket of suspicion and unacknowledged grief. The guests, at Miss Marple's quiet but insistent request, had gathered once more in the drawing-room. The air was charged, thick with the unspoken accusations that had been simmering beneath the surface since Alara Vance's body was found. Sir Humphrey Gower stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid with indignation. Alistair Finch sat with his hands clasped, his face an impassive mask. Julian Devereux paced restlessly, his movements jerky and agitated. Lady Agnes, pale and silent, simply watched from a hubbaked chair, a figure of crumbling grandeur. Miss Marple, a small, unassuming woman in a world of big egos, stood by the window. She did not raise her voice, but her every word was a stone dropped into the tense silence of the room. I have asked you to gather here not for a pleasant chat, but for a confrontation with the truth, she began, her voice as clear and steady as a mountain stream. The doctor, in his haste, was mistaken. Alara Vance did not die of a heart attack. A collective gasp, a chorus of disbelief, filled the room. Sir Humphrey laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Nonsense, woman. The doctor was quite clear. Are you suggesting you know better? In this instance, yes, Miss Marple replied. Calmly, I know that Alara died from a specific and potent poison. I found the traces of it in her room, the faint but distinct smell of bitter almonds, and I found the vessel it was carried in. She held up a small, antique silver locket, very same one Alara had been clutching. The locket was empty, its contents consumed, and the inside of the tiny compartment was stained with a peculiar purple residue. It was a poison that leaves behind a residue, and its symptoms, as I am sure you all know now, are tragically easy to mistake for a heart attack. She paused, letting the information sink in. The silence was absolute. Everyone was staring at the locket, the symbol of a stolen life now in Miss Marple's hands. The poison used was not a modern one. It was a rare, almost forgotten compound, she continued. A poison with a long and sinister history right here at Chimneys. It was, as I have been told by Lady Agnes, a family secret. The locket itself was never intended as a piece of jewellery. It was a vessel of death, used by an ancestor long ago to murder a rival. The killer not only had access to Chimneys, but also to its dark family secrets. She looked from face to face, her gentle gaze missing nothing. The poison, I believe, was never intended for Alara Vance. It was meant for Lord Chimneys. The killer intended to murder him and was here this weekend with that very purpose. Her words hit them like a physical blow. The guests began to shift, to fidget, to glance nervously at each other. The veneer of polite society was gone, replaced by the raw fear of exposure. Each of you had a motive, Miss Marple went on, her tone still a quiet, conversational one, though her words were like daggers. Sir Humphrey, your political career was on the verge of collapse. Lord Chimneys had promised you the funding and then maliciously withdrew it, leaving you financially and professionally ruined. You had a motive born of humiliation and a burning desire for revenge. Sir Humphrey opened his mouth to protest, but Miss Marple simply continued. Mr. Finch, your motive was blackmail. Lord Chimneys knew of an old financial indiscretion, a scandal that could have destroyed your reputation and your entire career. He had you under his thumb, and you had a motive born of a desperate need to reclaim control. Alistair Finch's face remained a blank slate, but Miss Marple saw the telltale tick of a muscle in his jaw, a tiny flicker of the rage he was struggling to contain. "And Julian," she said, her voice softening for the artist, "Lord Chimneys had promised you a great commission, only to ruin you professionally with a single, cruel public denunciation. Your motive was one of artistic and personal betrayal, a feeling of being used and discarded." She had laid out the case, not against a single person, but against the entire room. She had shown them the method, the motive, and the opportunity. The air crackled with unspoken accusations as the guests glared at each other, each seeing a killer in the other's face. But the plan, as I believe it to be, went tragically wrong, Miss Marple concluded. The killer intended to use the locket to dispense the poison to Lord Chimneys, perhaps in his wine, perhaps in a food he was fond of. But at some point, Alara Vance, who held the locket so dear, became the unintended victim. Perhaps she handled it, perhaps she opened it, mistaking it for a gift from a friend. She took the poison meant for Lord Chimneys, and she died. The room was silent, save for the frantic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. The guests were trapped in a web of their own greed and resentment. The killer was in the room, and everyone knew it. "The killer is among us," Miss Marple stated simply, her gaze sweeping over the faces, no longer gentle but unwavering, in that precise moment. Under the unbearable weight of her words, a man broke. It was Sir Humphrey. His face, already a mottled red, became a mask of pure terror and desperation. He stumbled back from the fireplace, his hands flailing. He let out a choked, desperate sound that was half a sob, half a shout. "It was me," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "It was me." The old man had it coming. "He ruined me, I tell you. Ruined me. I was going to put the poison in his wine at dinner. But he was so loud, so pompous, I was afraid to be seen. I saw the locket in his study, and I put the poison inside, thinking it would be a perfect, quiet end for him, a poetic justice. I thought he would take it. I never meant for the girl to die, I swear it. It was a mistake, a terrible, terrible mistake." His confession, a torrent of shame and grief and rage, crashed over the room like a wave. It was loud, detailed, and utterly convincing. It was the truth, or so it seemed. The killer had been found. The mystery was solved. But as the guests stared, in shock at the crumpled figure of the politician, Miss Marple simply stood by the window, her expression unreadable. She watched Sir Humphrey, but her eyes held a deeper, more profound suspicion. It was a perfect confession, too perfect. The motives were there, the opportunity, the method. Yet something about the confession felt hollow, rehearsed. Her face was calm, but her mind was already moving on, a new, more terrifying thought taking root. Sir Humphrey had confessed, but had he confessed the truth? Or had he simply confessed to a lie that someone else had already set in motion? Chapter 6. The Quiet Conclusion. The room, still thick with the echoes of Sir Humphrey's desperate confession, was now a place of stunned silence. The politician, a man stripped of all his bluster, sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. The other guests, though shaken by the raw emotion of the scene, felt a sense of relief. The killer had been found. The tidy, albeit tragic, narrative of a jealous, humiliated man seeking revenge had been neatly tied up. A final, dreadful chapter had been written, but Miss Marple did not move. She looked from the defeated figure of Sir Humphrey to the faces of the others, her quiet gaze missing nothing. She saw the relief, but she also saw the puzzle pieces that still did not fit. "It is a most compelling confession," Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through the stillness. "But it is not the truth." The silence that followed was far more absolute than before. Everyone turned to her, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "What in heaven's name are you talking about, woman?" Sir Humphrey rasped, lifting his tear-streaked face. "I just told you I did it. I confessed." "You confessed to what you believed you did," Miss Marple corrected him gently. "You confessed to poisoning a locket to take revenge on Lord Chimneys. And you confessed to your great sorrow that Alara Vance became the victim. But you confessed to a crime that was already committed." She turned her back on the broken politician and looked directly at Lady Agnes, the hostess, a figure of eccentric theatricality, was now simply a widow in mourning. She sat very still, her face pale, her hands clasped on her lap. Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering, and it seemed to peel back the layers of grief and eccentricity to reveal a cold, hard core of calculation. The poison used was a very old, very specific family secret, was it not, Agnes? Miss Marple continued, her voice gaining a quiet power. The knowledge of how to use the locket, what to put in it, and where to find the specific poison belonged to a very small circle of people. A circle of people who have lived in this house for a very long time. Lady Agnes's face, which had been a mask of sorrow, began to harden. The person who truly committed this crime was not motivated by a sudden burst of rage. They were motivated by a cold, desperate fear of a future without a fortune. You knew, didn't you, Agnes, that your husband was planning to change his will? You didn't know to whom, but you feared the worst. You feared that all of this, the legacy, your own comfort, was about to be taken away from you. "This is madness," Lady Agnes said, her voice flat. "I am a grieving widow. How dare you make such accusations? Because the evidence, Agnes, points to you, and only you," Miss Marple said calmly. "You were the only person with the motive, the intimate knowledge, and the opportunity to pull this off so perfectly. You were the only one who truly knew the history of the locket and its grim purpose. You had to have retrieved the poison from its hiding place, and you had to have placed it in the locket, and you had to have made sure it found its way into Elara's hands." A thin, venomous smile touched Lady Agnes's lips. "And why would I do that, Jane? Why not simply give it to him myself?" "Because," Miss Marple replied, her tone softening to a devastating pity, "you could not risk being caught. Lord Chimneys was a cruel and theatrical man. He would have announced his new will with a flourish, knowing it would cause chaos. You knew that once the will was read, it would be too late. You had to strike before it could be officially read and registered. You had to remove Alara, the unexpected heir, before she could claim her inheritance." Lady Agnes's composure finally broke. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He was going to give everything away to that vapid little girl, she spat, her voice no longer that of a grieving widow, but of a scorned woman. "He humiliated me for years, And then he was going to humiliate me even in death. This house, this legacy, it was mine. I was not going to stand by and watch him give it all away to an actress he met in a park. Her confession was as cold and calculated as the murder itself. She confirmed every detail, her voice a low, chilling whisper. She had seen her opportunity, had placed the poison in the locket, and had given it to Alara, knowing that her husband, in his twisted game, would have told her it was a special, symbolic gift. She had hoped Alara would take the poison innocently, believing it was a symbolic ritual, thereby dying before the will could be read. Alara's death, though tragic, was merely a detail in her grand plan. At that moment, the front door of Chimneys opened and two uniformed policemen entered, their presence a stark contrast to the morbid melodrama of the room. Miss Marple, in her quiet way, had made a prearranged signal. The other guests were speechless, their faces a mix of horror and relief. Sir Humphrey, realizing his confession had been a tragic miscalculation, simply stared at Lady Agnes in disbelief. He had confessed to a crime he believed he had committed, a desperate act of rage, but the true murderer was a woman whose act was one of cold, precise calculation. As the police led Lady Agnes away, her head held high in a final, defiant gesture. A profound silence descended upon Chimneys. The house, once a stage for a dark drama, was now simply a place of cold, hard facts. The mystery was over. The innocent had been cleared, and the guilty had been brought to a chilling justice. Miss Marple, her work done, moved to a chair by the dying fire. A servant brought her a cup of tea, its warmth a welcome comfort in the now empty room. She sat there, the quiet victor, sipping her tea, her mind already moving on to the simple, small truths of village life. The poisoned pocket, a symbol of a long-ago crime, had become the tool for a new one, a tangled web of human greed and betrayal. But the web, like all such things, had been unravelled by a pair of sharp eyes and a quiet, unassuming mind.